What if Jesus had children? What if his bloodline didn't end at the cross, but was carried in secret across oceans of time, protected by kings, concealed by knights, and hunted by popes? What if the Holy Grail was never a cup at all, but a living, breathing lineage, one that still exists today? You've heard the fragments, Dan Brown, Da Vinci, Templars, but beneath the fiction lies something older and far stranger. A royal family erased from history, a code written not in ink, but in blood. And now, after centuries of silence, the story is whispering again. But to hear it, really hear it, you have to slow down. Let the centuries peel back. Let the myths fall silent. Let your breath match the rhythm of old stone halls where forgotten kings once walked. This isn't just a story. It's a revelation that stretches across empires, churches, and graves. It begins, as many secrets do, with a death. The year was 679. A chill crept across the woods of the Ardennes. The birds had gone quiet, and in the shadows of a Roman road, something sacred was shattered. Dagobert II, the last fully sovereign king of the Merovingian line, was murdered, allegedly on the orders of the church. A spear to the eye, or maybe a knife to the throat. No chronicler agrees, but what they do agree on is this: Dagobert was the last obstacle, and once he fell, the door opened to a new age of rulers. Ones more compliant, more useful, and most importantly, ones without divine blood. Because that's what the Merovingians claimed, not merely to be royalty, not merely to be chosen, but to be descended directly from the sacred. A bloodline stretching back not just to David, not just to Abraham, but beyond that, to Galilee, to a carpenter, to a woman with red hair fleeing by boat, her belly full of prophecy. It sounds impossible, outlandish, like something from the margins of a conspiracy forum. But history has always hidden its truths best when they're disguised as lunacy. And as you'll see, the deeper you go into this story, the harder it becomes to dismiss. The Merovingians ruled much of what is now France, Belgium, and Germany. Their kings were marked by strange traditions, never cutting their hair, claiming visions, wielding power through mysticism rather than force. They were revered as God-chosen, even feared as semi-divine. But then suddenly they were gone, quietly, bloodlessly, erased from power and eventually from the record. Their names scrubbed, their tombs hidden, their children hunted. And in their place came the Carolingians, the dynasty that gave us Charlemagne, the dynasty the church wanted in power. Now, centuries later, clues to the Merovingian past are re-emerging. Coded texts, secret societies, lost gospels, whispered names, and always the same lingering question: why did the church try so hard to make us forget them? Some say it's because the Merovingians were heretics. Others say they were too powerful, too independent, too magical. But the most dangerous theory of all, the one we'll explore tonight, is that the Merovingians were removed not because of what they did, but because of who they were. And more frightening still, because of who they still might be. Because blood doesn't vanish. It flows through centuries, through generations, through veins, and perhaps, just perhaps, through someone alive today. So settle in, dim the lights, let your curiosity stretch its legs, and allow your doubts to nap in the corner for a while. You're about to step into a mystery older than kings, deeper than dogma, and sharper than any sword ever raised in its defense. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You picture it now. Deep forest, pale mist rising from damp leaves, and the heavy scent of pine and silence. The year is 679. Somewhere along the Ardennes, a hunting party moves with uneasy quiet. Among them rides Dagobert II, King of Austrasia, wrapped in a heavy cloak of royal blue. His face is lined, but his eyes burn bright with something that doesn't belong in these woods, something like purpose. It would be the last journey he ever made. History tells us little of the moments before his death. One account claims he was isolated from his guard. Another says he was betrayed by a servant. Either way, the king was murdered, and what followed was even stranger than the silence of his death. The chroniclers stopped writing, not just about Dagobert, but about the line he came from. It was as if the ink froze in midair and the royal blood spilled quietly into the dirt, unremembered. Dagobert wasn't a rebel or a failed monarch. On the contrary, he had only recently returned from exile in Ireland, where he'd lived under the protection of the church. He was restored to the throne with the blessing of bishops and nobles alike, suggesting he had allies in high places. Yet just a few short years later, he was gone, assassinated under mysterious circumstances and with almost no recorded outrage. That in itself raises eyebrows. Monarchs don't just vanish without consequence. unless someone wanted him gone and wanted him forgotten. Now, here's the curious part. Dagobert's son, Dagobert IV, should have inherited the throne. By all accounts, he was alive, a legitimate heir. But he never ruled. No crowning, no ceremony, no resistance, nothing. His name slipped from the annals of official history like a stone tossed into a deep, dark well. Some whisper he fled to the south, to the region now called Languedoc. Others say he was hidden by monks loyal to the Merovingian cause. A few bolder voices, rare and often laughed off, claim he was taken to a small village in the Pyrenees where he lived under another name and where his descendants still walk today. It all smells like a cover-up. And if you're feeling that gentle tingle down your spine, you're not alone. Because Dagobert II wasn't just a king. He was the last of a very specific kind of king. His family, the Merovingians, claimed something older than conquest or crown. They claimed divine blood. To understand why his death mattered so much, you need to look at what the Merovingians believed about themselves. Unlike most dynasties that leaned on military strength or divine right through papal endorsement, the Merovingians saw themselves as sacred by birth. Their long hair was never cut, believed to be a vessel of spiritual power. Their kings were said to be born under celestial signs, capable of healing by touch and gifted with visions. Their authority didn't just come from Rome, it came from the heavens. This wasn't political posturing. These beliefs were baked into the bones of their rule, and for many early Christians, that blurred the line between king and saint in unsettling ways. A monarch who didn't need the church to legitimize him was dangerous, particularly one who whispered of an ancient bloodline stretching not just back to David, but further to Galilee, to that quiet carpenter's son who died on a Roman cross, and may have left behind more than teachings. Of course, mainstream history scoffs. There's no academic consensus that Jesus had children. The canonical Gospels are silent on the matter, and any suggestion otherwise is quickly branded speculative, if not outright heretical. But even so, fringe documents, Gnostic Gospels, and oral traditions persist. The Gospel of Philip, for example, speaks curiously of Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene, calling her his companion, a term whose Greek roots can imply a spouse. Interpretations vary, scholars argue, and certainly slips like water through fingers. Still, the idea persisted, especially in pockets of Europe where Roman oversight was weaker and older traditions clung like moss to old stone. The Merovingians, ruling Gaul in the post-Roman vacuum, had ample room to forge their myths. And if those myths involve sacred ancestry, you can see how the church, desperate to assert orthodoxy and control, might view them as a threat. And here lies the real tension. If Dagobert II died because of his beliefs, or worse, because of his blood, then his assassination wasn't just political. It was theological, a crime committed not merely to seize a throne, but to suppress a legacy. One of the strangest details supporting this view comes not from an ancient scroll, but from a 20th century document known as the Dossier Secrets de Henri Lobineau, filed quietly in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This modern text claims that Dagobert's line continued in secret, protected by a society known as the Priory of Sion. According to the dossier, Dagobert IV survived and eventually founded a new dynasty in the south, one that never claimed its rights, but quietly maintained its blood. The document is controversial. Many believe it's a hoax, a mid-century invention, but its inclusion of obscure medieval details, like the layout of certain tombs and heraldic lineages, has puzzled even its critics. And more curiously, the dossier appeared long before the Da Vinci Code popularized these ideas. In other words, someone was whispering this story long before it became cool to chase grails through cathedrals. It raises a question that still floats unanswered above the forest floor where Dagobert fell. If there was nothing to hide, why was so much effort made to erase him? Not just politically, but spiritually, symbolically, genealogically. The silence around Dagobert's death doesn't feel like a historical footnote. It feels like a redacted paragraph, a space where something holy or dangerous once stood. And that silence has echoes. You stand now in a shadowed hall of memory, a place that smells of incense and iron, where the light is always slightly dimmed by something ancient. The floor is stone, and the air carries the hushed reverence of an old cathedral. At the far end, a throne not gilded, but carved from dark wood, tangled with serpents, bees, and curling vines. No crown rests upon it, only a single lock of long, golden hair. Welcome to the world of the Merovingian kings, not just of land, but of legend. They weren't like the others, from the 5th to the 8th century. The Merovingian dynasty ruled over large swaths of what we now call France and Western Europe. They were the Reges Creniti, the long-haired kings, a title that wasn't fashionably poetic. It was spiritual law. A Merovingian ruler was never to cut his hair. It was said to house his sacred power, his divine sanction. To shear a Merovingian was to strip him of his right to rule. A trimmed head was no longer holy. It was political heresy, like yanking out the very soul of the state with scissors. This wasn't superstition born from vanity. The tradition likely emerged from pre-Christian roots, from Druidic and pagan beliefs woven with early Christian mythology. In some ways, the Merovingians were syncretic rulers, fusing the old gods and the new gospel. Their kings were said to possess prophetic dreams, anointed destinies, and a healing touch. Echoes of both Celtic seers and biblical figures. Their people didn't just fear them, they venerated them. One of the earliest kings, Clovis I, provides a pivotal lens. In 496, he converted to Christianity, Roman Christianity, to be precise, and was baptized at Reims, allegedly with the descent of a dove and a vial of holy oil from heaven itself. Yes, it's dramatic, but more than a miracle, this marked a quiet submission, a shifting of loyalties from the old gods of Gaul to the rising power of the Latin Church. Still, even under this Christian veneer, strange things bubbled beneath the surface. Clovis's lineage, according to later legends, was not entirely of this world. His supposed ancestor, Merovic, the dynasty's namesake, was said to be born from a sea creature, perhaps a quinator, a bull-headed sea beast, or maybe something closer to Neptune. Again, it sounds absurd, but remember, ancient symbolism often wrapped deeper truths in mythological skins. Merovic's oceanic origin might have signified an otherworldly bloodline, something ancient, pure, and deliberately set apart from the ordinary mortal line. It's this blend, half myth, half history, that gave the Merovingians their power. They didn't rely solely on armies or taxation. Their rule was mystical, bound to the land and people through something deeper than politics. Their kings weren't just rulers, they were symbols, living relics, which makes their eventual erasure even more suspicious. Because here's the strange historical fact: by the time Dagobert II died, the Merovingian line had lost most of its political power. In name, they were still kings, but in truth, the kingdom was run by the mayors of the palace, chief officials who controlled administration, finances, and armies. These mayors were the prototypes of the smiling bureaucrats behind the curtain, and most notably, the line of mayors included one Pepin of Herstal, whose descendant, Pepin the Short, would eventually seize the crown and start the Carolingian dynasty. This transition was not a bloody coup. It was a slow fade, a bureaucratic whisper. The Merovingians were gradually rendered symbolic. When their usefulness expired, they were quietly retired to monasteries, haircut, titles revoked, bloodline diluted into nothing more than a forgotten branch on the royal family tree. But here is the question that lingers like candle smoke. Why all the ceremonial effort? To disempower without destroying? If the Merovingians had become irrelevant, why not execute them, banish them violently? Why tuck them away into quiet cloisters, slowly erasing their memory while allowing the family itself, at least in name, to remain? The answer might lie in fear, or reverence, or something stranger still. Some believe the church saw the Merovingians not merely as obsolete rulers, but as rivals to Christ himself. If the Merovingians truly believed themselves descended from Jesus through Mary Magdalene and a secret child, then their claim to power would threaten not just kingship, but doctrine. Christianity's foundation hinges on the idea of divine sacrifice, not divine succession. A Jesus who left behind a lineage is a Jesus grounded in blood, not solely in spirit. That would make the Merovingians living heresy, and heresy is far more dangerous when it walks, talks, and claims a throne. Adding a surreal twist to this already murky history is an obscure Merovingian practice known as divine vision. In several surviving chronicles, kings were described as having the power to see signs before battle, dream of future events, or experience a sacred sleep. One tale speaks of King Guntram, who supposedly healed a leper with a kiss and was later canonized. Another describes Dagobert by dreaming of his own assassination years before it occurred. These aren't normal kingly behaviors. These are prophetic motifs, biblical patterns woven into medieval lives. Skeptics would say it's hagiography, embellishment to boost fame. But what if these tales weren't about exaggerating history, but preserving coded truths? That's where the modern debate begins to fracture. Some scholars argue the Merovingians were just one of many dynasties mythologized after the fact. Others, especially those outside mainstream academia, suspected deliberate suppression orchestrated by church scribes to protect orthodoxy. Even today, that argument continues to rage, mostly in quiet corners of esoteric conferences and the footnotes of niche journals. Did the Merovingians truly believe they were descended from Christ? Or did someone else want them to believe that to use them, elevate them, and eventually erase them once their purpose was served? There's no proof, not in the academic sense, but there is suggestion. The fragments of hair relics kept in monasteries, the odd consistencies in legends across France, the suppressed gospels, the shrines to Magdalene built in places she shouldn't have been, and always the symbols, the bees, the fleur-de-lis, the 5-pointed stars carved into stone as if waiting for someone to finally see them. When Dagobert II died, the silence wasn't just political, it was mythic. The curtain fell not just on a man, but on a mystery, and you can still feel it if you try. Walk through the ancient woods of the Ardennes. Listen to the hush that follows your footsteps. Somewhere in the soil, beneath layers of forgotten kings and moss-covered crypts, the story is still breathing, waiting to be told. You drift now beneath vaulted stone, where silence hums like a hymn to ancient for words. The Basilica of St. Denis looms over the outskirts of Paris like a grand reliquary for monarchs, a kind of necropolis castle hybrid, half cathedral, half memory palace. Nearly every king of France lies here, their names etched in marble. Their crowns long since oxidized now rest in museum cases. But here, under all that pageantry and ritual, lies a whisper the guides never mention. The tomb of Dagobert II is missing, or more accurately, it's not where it should be, which is odd, isn't it? This is St. Denis, hallowed ground, a place obsessed with housing the bones of royalty. Clovis is here, so are Charlemagne's heirs, but not Dagobert II. Instead, in a curious twist of legacy, Dagobert I, his grandfather, is interred here with full honors. There's even a carved inscription declaring his eternal rest. But his descendant, the murdered king, is absent from the official registry of saints, sovereigns, and sepulchres, and yet, there are whispers subtle, frustrating, persistent. In 872, a monk named Hincmar Reims wrote of a vision, divinely inspired, in which he was told Dagobert II was a saint, martyred unjustly and resting beneath the church of Stenay, far to the east. That claim led to the discovery of a tomb there, and for a time, Dagobert was even locally venerated as a saint. His feast day was marked, pilgrims came, a chapel was built in his honor. But then the story takes a familiar turn. Silence, veneration was discouraged. The church grew strangely tight-lipped. By the early 12th century, the cult of St. Dagobert had quietly vanished, not condemned, not debunked, just erased. So what lies beneath Stenay? According to some accounts, bones were found, not just one burial, but several, an entire royal configuration, a king, a woman, and a child. Their identities were never confirmed, and little physical evidence remains today, thanks in part to revolutions, wars, and renovations that treated old tombs like furniture. But rumors persist, not just of remains, but of objects. A sigil carved in stone, a relic box sealed with wax and marked with a now extinct crest, and in one particularly strange account, a small scroll of vellum with Hebrew lettering. None of these findings were ever publicly verified, of course, and those who investigated afar, like a certain Father Saunier, whom we'll meet again soon, often found themselves discouraged, exiled, or mysteriously enriched. This brings us to an obscure detail that nags at historians like a pebble in the boot. In 1653, a document surfaced in the Vatican archives known as the Chronicon Sionis. It described a hidden tomb under St. Denis, not the Grand Basilica as we see it today, but an older chamber, sealed and forgotten, containing a king of divine root, silenced by Rome, watched by bees. That phrase, watched by bees, has baffled researchers for decades. Bees were a Merovingian symbol, yes, but how would a 17th century document reference a motif that had been culturally dead for nearly a millennium? Some say forgery, others say coincidence, but a few believe the chronicle is a breadcrumb, one that points to a deliberate burial under the very place where kings were meant to be celebrated, not hidden. And here lies the uncomfortable question: if a secret tomb does exist under St. Denis, why hasn't it been unearthed? The French government has funded restorations of the basilica many times. Engineers and archaeologists have mapped much of the substructure, and yet, beneath certain sealed sections of the crypt, no excavation is permitted. One official explanation blames structural integrity. Those chambers, are simply too unstable, too risky to disturb. But when has risk ever stopped the modern world from drilling for oil, rebuilding cathedrals, or repaving the past? What if, instead, something lies beneath that is meant to remain sealed? There are also curious accounts from Napoleonic times. When the emperor visited St. Denis in 1806, he reportedly asked to view the royal tombs. After a long private viewing, he remarked, almost offhandedly, that some kings leave no name, only a legacy of silence. That line, quoted later in his journals, has led to speculation that Napoleon may have seen something the public did not. Some even suggest he borrowed Merovingian imagery for his own imperial regalia, specifically the bee. And here's where things take an even stranger turn. The bee, long forgotten as a royal symbol, suddenly re-emerged in Napoleon's empire, embroidered into robes, sewn into banners, etched into imperial seals. His reason: he claimed it was a symbol of French industriousness, but others believe he was nodding to a deeper lineage, a way of declaring himself heir not just to Rome, but to the oldest French bloodline of all. So we return to Dagobert II, a king erased, a saint desanctified, a tomb misplaced, and yet his name lingers on local chapels, half-erased documents, and a few too many conspiracy-laced footnotes. His presence is felt not in the grand narratives of French history, but in the gaps, the omissions, the silences. Modern scholars remain divided. Some say the missing tomb is a historical oddity, nothing more. Others suspect political sabotage. But the most intriguing theory of all is the one you're beginning to sense, like a pressure beneath the cathedral stones, that Dagobert II was buried with something that couldn't be exposed: a scroll, a gospel, a genealogy, something that would unravel the delicate weave of Christian legitimacy, if ever brought to light. And so, rather than destroy him, they hid him. But bones don't stay quiet forever, especially when the land remembers. And in the village of Stine, where the wind still carries the smell of wet earth and linden blossom, locals speak of dreams of a tall man in blue, of a queen who never speaks, and a boy holding a golden orb, watching from the chapel door. Whether they're memories or myths hardly matters anymore. Either way, the tomb is whispering. Can you hear it? Imagine a dim reading room in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, mahogany paneled, quiet enough to hear the scratch of a fountain pen. In 1975, a researcher named Pierre Planard walks into this room and files a strange set of documents under an even stranger name: Dossiers Secrets to Henry Lobineau. On their own, these papers seem eccentric: genealogical charts, obscure correspondences, lists of grand masters of a supposed secret society called the Priory of Sion. But within their tangled calligraphy lies the spark that would ignite the modern Grail mythos and change how we view European history forever. These dossiers, archival ghosts planted without context, claim something extraordinary: that the Merovingian bloodline had not died, but had simply gone underground. According to these pages, Dagobert II's son, Sigebert IV, had escaped assassination and taken refuge in the Languedoc region of southern France. From there, his descendants continued in secrecy, protected by an ancient brotherhood sworn to preserve the sacred bloodline of Christ. It was a bold claim, and yet, buried within the flamboyant storytelling was something quietly unsettling: details too precise, too obscure to dismiss outright. Ancient family trees listed obscure nobles, their titles meticulously cross-referenced. There were seals resembling early Merovingian symbology, even references to real historical figures like Bertrand de Blanchefort, a Grand Master of the Knights Templar, whose life suddenly appeared reinterpreted through the lens of guardianship, not warfare. The Priory of Sion, the documents claimed, had existed since at least the 11th century, possibly earlier, not merely as a religious society or monastic order, but as the shadow hand behind major European events. They were protectors of a bloodline so powerful it threatened the very structure of church and empire, and their mission: to preserve the Grail, not the chalice, but the line that sang real, the royal blood. You might feel the tug of skepticism tighten just behind your eyes. Fair enough. After all, the Priory of Sion has long been a historical curiosity with very little hard proof. Planard himself was later exposed for embellishment, even invention. But here's the twist. Although parts of the dossiers were fabricated, not all of it was false. Some genealogies have been verified. Some tombs referenced only in the documents were found right where they were described. Even the list of supposed Grand Masters includes names like Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo, so absurdly high profile that it either screams hoax or deliberate distraction. There's also the problem of timing. The dossiers appeared before the Grail craze exploded into popular culture, long before the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, before Dan Brown, before whispered tours of Rosslyn Chapel. So if this was merely a hoax, it was astonishingly prescient. And then there's the Lobino map, an innocuous addition to the dossier containing subtle symbols laid over the region of Rennes-le-Château. Those symbols, later aligned, albeit loosely, with topographical anomalies that had been the subject of local legends for centuries. In one case, a ridgeline marked with an 8-pointed star matched almost perfectly the foundation of a ruined Templar outpost. Coincidence, possibly, but the pattern is there. Whether you believe it or not, historians continue to wrestle with this. Some dismiss the dossiers as elaborate fantasy, others acknowledge that while Plannard may have embellished, he likely believed the core of what he published. He even claimed under oath in a French court to be a direct descendant of the Merovingians. That part didn't hold under legal scrutiny, but curiously, the court didn't prosecute him for fraud. The matter was dropped quietly, without further public inquiry. So the question isn't just whether the Priory of Sion exists, it's whether it ever needed to. Throughout history, noble families have preserved their lineages with obsessive care. Cloistered daughters, strategic marriages, hidden heirs, none of this is new. What is unusual is the religious weight attached to the Merovingian bloodline. If the church believed these claims, even slightly, the political risk would have been staggering. A bloodline claiming descent from Jesus would undermine centuries of papal authority. The church's hierarchy would no longer be the mediator between God and man, because the mediator would be walking, breathing, ruling. This may be why in certain Vatican records, there are notations about potential heretical lines. Most are vague, dismissive, but some curiously redacted entries reference unnamed French families and unusual patterns of inheritance. The dossiers also mention something chilling, a vault somewhere beneath the Pyrenees, allegedly holding the Merovingian genealogy along with sacred artifacts, perhaps even the bones of Magdalene herself. Again, no proof, just an idea. But this idea has been enough to spur generations of treasure hunters, scholars, and secret societies into quiet obsession. And this brings us to an uncomfortable observation. Whether or not the Priory of Sion exists as an organized body, the effect of the idea has been enormous. Since the release of the dossiers, there's been a measurable uptick in encrypted texts, fringe archaeological digs, and accidental discoveries that link back, somehow, to this story. A mosaic found in a ruined church depicting a red-haired woman holding a chalice. A forgotten painting of a king in blue robes watched over by bees. A gravestone unearthed in silence that bore no name, only a Latin phrase, sangue non mortur, blood does not die. Is all of this a coincidence? A pattern born from the mind's need to connect dots where none exist? Or is it something more deliberate, like echoes of a truth that refuse to stay buried? Even among skeptics, there's reluctant agreement. The idea of the Priory of Sion has teeth. It has structure, language, and just enough grounding in actual history to make it dangerous, which is precisely what makes it so effective. So perhaps the dossiers were never meant to prove the existence of a secret society. Perhaps they were a smoke signal, an invitation to look again at the cracks in the cathedral walls, the absences in royal registers, the names spoken in dreams, but not in records. After all, secrets rarely shout. They whisper, sometimes in ancient parchment, sometimes through missing tombs, and sometimes, more unsettlingly, in plain sight. Picture a weathered fortress at dawn, its turrets wrapped in morning mist. Beneath its stone vaults, a group of knights kneels in silence, their white mantles marked by a red cross, swords laid upon the altar like sacred relics. This is not merely a military order, it is a ritual, in motion, a mystery encoded in obedience. And at the heart of it, if the stories are to be believed, is a secret older than any sword, more potent than any oath, the bloodline they may have sworn to protect. The Knights Templar warrior monks of the Holy Land, defenders of pilgrims, founders of Europe's first international banking network, have long been at the center of religious fascination. Their rise was meteoric. From humble beginnings in 1119 as protectors of a single road in Jerusalem, they grew into one of the most powerful forces in Christendom. Popes blessed them, kings feared them, and within a century, their order stretched from Portugal to Palestine, with castles, farms, fleets, and vaults stuffed with gold and secrets. But what exactly were they guarding? The official version tells us they protected pilgrims, fought in crusades, and served as the shock troops of Christian orthodoxy. But alternative accounts, often dismissed as fringe, tell a deeper tale of story that connects the Templars not just to Jerusalem, but to something beneath it. Shortly after their formation, the Templars set up headquarters on the Temple Mount in what had once been the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This spot, tradition holds, was built atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple, and while officially there to protect the site, the Templars soon began digging quietly for years. No construction projects, no recorded purpose, just digging, and then, just as quietly, they stopped. What were they searching for? Some believe it was the Ark of the Covenant. Others suggest scrolls, early lost rituals, sacred relics. But among the more persistent theories is this, that they found proof of the sacred bloodline, not metaphor, but names, dates, genealogies of buried truth linking Christ to descendants. A truth that would place the Merovingians at the center of a spiritual revolution, and the church in a very uncomfortable position. Of course, there's no hard evidence of what they found, but there is a shift. After their return to Europe, the Templars became different. They grew in wealth and political influence. They began erecting cathedrals and chapels using architectural forms never before seen, geometry steeped in sacred symbolism, circles, pentagrams, black madonnas. Some even claimed the layout of certain Templar sites mirrored star constellations or Kabbalistic patterns. Their rituals became more opaque, their hierarchy more secretive. And then there's the curious case of their downfall. By the early 1300s, the Templars had grown to powerful. King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to them, turned on the order. In 1307, on Friday the 13th, a date that would become ominous, they were arrested en masse, tortured, forced to confess to heresy, worship of strange idols, blasphemous rites, homosexuality, rituals involving a disembodied head. It all sounds too wild, too convenient. And yet, under torture, many confessed to something. They spoke of a knowledge too great for men, of a truth the church feared. One even hinted at a bloodline, a line that stretches to the east and yet remains here with us. Were these just the ravings of broken men, or fragments of a secret too old to name? An obscure, but well-documented fragment surfaces here, the Chinan Parchment, discovered in the Vatican's secret archives in 2001. It reveals that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templars of heresy before their executions. Why absolve them and then allow their destruction? Was it guilt or fear? Another strange detail appears in the trial records, the repeated reference to a head, sometimes called Baphomet, sometimes the head of wisdom. Scholars argue endlessly about what this meant: an idol, a preserved relic, a symbol. But the most chilling theory is this, that it was not a mere object, but a relic of the bloodline, a literal head, maybe even the mummified remains of someone important, someone with a bloodline too sacred to destroy and too dangerous to reveal. It's here we circle back to the Merovingians. Some versions of the legend claim that the Templars weren't just defenders of pilgrims, but of a lineage, that their true mission, the reason for their secrecy and power, was the protection of descendants, those born of that ancient union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the Sangreal, the royal blood. And the name that appears most often in these whispers is Dagobert II. A few even believe that the Templars didn't lose their power. They simply transferred it into other groups, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucian secret societies that inherited not just symbols, but the mission to guard the bloodline until the world was ready. Modern historians push back. Of course, the evidence is scattered, circumstantial, and yet the pieces fit too snugly to dismiss out of hand. Why did the Templars guard the Temple Mount? Why did they dig in secret? Why were their rituals cloaked in silence? Why did so many of them go willingly to their deaths, never revealing what they truly served? It might be that the Templars were more than protectors. They may have been archivists, midwives of history, or perhaps usurpers. Because here's the darker twist. Some believe the Templars didn't merely guard the bloodline, they used it, that they may have appropriated its power, its legitimacy, its symbolism for themselves, that the true descendants were pushed aside, hidden, forgotten, while others cloaked themselves in borrowed divinity. After all, secrecy is a double-edged sword. What's hidden can be protected, but it can also be stolen. And so the question stands, sharp as a blade in the dark. Were the Knights Templar the loyal defenders of a sacred truth, or cunning stewards of a legacy they claimed but never truly owned? You can almost hear the stone doors closing behind you, the echoes of steel boots, the rustle of a banner, and somewhere, just beneath the silence, the heartbeat of a secret still guarded by men who never speak. The word of Holy Grail summons images, a glittering chalice, a knight kneeling in mist, a glowing cup held aloft in a beam of sunlight. perhaps in an Arthurian forest or at the edge of some enchanted chapel. It's a symbol embedded so deeply in our cultural imagination that we rarely question it. The Grail is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, a sacred object of untold power. Except, what if it isn't? What if the Grail was never a cup? What if it was a person? The reimagining of the Holy Grail as sangreal, not sangreal. The Holy Grail, but sangreal. The royal blood isn't just a linguistic trick. It's a conceptual rupture, a redirection of centuries of myth, shifting the focus from relic to inheritance, from vessel to lineage. And at the core of this theory is a breathtaking claim that the Grail represents not the cup that held Christ's blood, but the bloodline itself alive, hidden and passed down through generations. Let's trace the origin of the idea. The earliest Grail stories don't mention Christ's cup. The 12th century writings of Chrétien de Troyes, generally considered the beginning of the Grail legend, describe a mysterious procession involving a golden Grail, but offer no explanation of what it is. Only later, through authors like Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Eschenbach, did the cup become explicitly linked to Christian relics. Even then, the details shift. Sometimes it's the cup of the Last Supper. Sometimes it catches Christ's blood at the cross. Sometimes it grants immortality. Sometimes healing. Sometimes nothing at all. The variability itself is suspicious. The Grail never had a fixed identity. It was a cipher, a symbol waiting to be filled with meaning. So why not this meaning? Why not a bloodline? Those who subscribe to the bloodline theory point out that most Grail stories center not on finding the cup, but on understanding it. Grail quests are inward journeys. The knight doesn't just stumble upon the object. He must be worthy of it. Often, only those of pure heart or noble lineage can even approach the Grail, let alone comprehend its mystery. This has led some to suggest that the Grail is less an object, more a truth, a hidden knowledge encoded into the fabric of dynastic succession. And perhaps most compellingly, the earliest Grail romances were often written in the same regions associated with Merovingian legends, southern France, Languedoc, Occitania, precisely where stories of Mary Magdalene's exile and the bloodline survival also took root. Coincidence, possibly, but coincidences, like riddles, tend to multiply when ignored. Now consider this. In several early Grail texts, the Grail bearer is a woman, impars evil. She's called Repentance de Joy, a name suspiciously similar to she who dispenses joy. She doesn't wield a sword. She doesn't rule a kingdom. She carries, she preserves. In a few versions, she's even described as being pregnant, a symbolic mother. Could the Grail in these stories be a code? Could the bearer of the Grail be the protector of the bloodline? A Magdalene figure in literary disguise. The idea gathered momentum in modern times, thanks in part to the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which proposed that the Grail tradition was a cover story, a poetic myth built to preserve dangerous truths that the stories of Perceval, Lancelot, and Galahad were symbolic echoes of an underground tradition designed to protect the line of descent from Christ. Again, traditional scholars reject this notion as speculative, but their arguments often hinge on the absence of direct proof, not the implausibility of the claim. And as we've seen, absence is not evidence of nothing. Sometimes it's the most curious evidence of all. If you dig deeper into symbolism, the shift becomes even more compelling. The cup, in alchemical and mystical traditions, is the feminine principle of the vessel, the womb, to reinterpret the Grail as Mary Magdalene, or more precisely, as the sacred womb that bore Christ's child, is not only consistent with ancient symbology, it unlocks layers of coherence in the myth. In this light, the quest for the Grail becomes something much more intimate, more heretical. It's not a hunt for a relic, it's a search for origin, for continuity, for the truth of inheritance. And suddenly, the Church's uneasy relationship with the Magdalene makes far more sense. For centuries, Mary Magdalene was slandered, rebranded as a prostitute despite no biblical basis. Her role in the resurrection narratives, her close relationship to Jesus, her importance among the disciples, all of it was minimized or distorted. But why? Why would the early church go to such lengths to diminish a woman so clearly central to Christ's ministry, unless, of course, she represented something dangerous, not just spiritual insight, but blood, not just love, or lineage. The shift from chalice to child also reframes the myth of the lost Grail. If the Grail is a bloodline, then it cannot be found in a vault, a cave, or a hidden chapel. It lives in people, in families, in descendants. It explains why so many Grail tales end not with triumphant discovery, but with ambiguous departure. the Grail disappears. It is taken away, or it is revealed only to vanish again, as if to say, you cannot possess it. You must be born from it. And perhaps most chilling of all, if the church knew this, they had every reason to bury it. A relic can be enshrined, a doctrine can be debated, but a bloodline, a living human being who embodies a truth, that undermines the entire theology of divine mystery. That it's not a theological inconvenience. That's a revolution waiting to happen. So, here we are, centuries of myth, dozens of versions, and at the center, a cup that may not be a cup at all. A grail that is not chased through forests, but through family trees. And maybe, just maybe, the thread we imagined earlier, the one stretching from Galilee to Gaul, isn't fiction, it's DNA. Close your eyes. Now imagine a dim-lit cathedral, not a stone, but of data. Vast halls of hard drives humming with quiet urgency. Shelves of ancient texts rendered into code. Dustless vaults that do not breathe or remember. We have arrived in the present, but not quite the now you know. This is the new frontier of the old mystery, the search for the Merovingian bloodline in the digital age. For centuries, researchers were constrained by geography and gatekeeping. Access to rare manuscripts required political pull, papal blessing, or centuries of privilege. But today, millions of documents, papal bulls, church records, noble genealogies, even esoteric manuscripts, once locked behind Vatican doors, are being digitized. And somewhere in that tidal wave of metadata, keyword strings, and cross-linked annotations may be the code that breaks the silence. Artificial intelligence is already helping genealogists make connections human researchers would have missed. It doesn't tire. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't dismiss what looks like coincidence. It finds patterns, names recurring across centuries, marriages that bridge forgotten dynasties, dates that align with eclipses and rituals and whispered births. The algorithms don't care about orthodoxy. They aren't interested in preserving narratives. They just match data, and lately, they've been finding things. Take, for instance, a project launched quietly by an independent researcher in 2021, using natural language processing on thousands of scanned ecclesiastical documents from the 13th and 14th centuries. They trained an AI to identify references to non-canonical figures, individuals mentioned in church records who appeared tied to religious centers but held no official titles. One name came up repeatedly across France, Spain, and southern England: Magdalena di Sangri. Always female, always appearing in proximity to royal baptisms, noble weddings, and sudden deaths. The name itself is suspicious. Magdalena, clearly invoking the disciple, and Sangri, a fusion of blood and sacred. Some say it was a priest's code, others believe it was the pseudonym of a living custodian of the line. Either way, the pattern was clear. She appeared with a legacy needed protecting. That researcher's online presence is no longer active. There's also been a renewed digital excavation of the dossier's secrets, the infamous Priory of Sion documents. Most have been written off as fabrications, but by applying stylometric analysis, essentially a digital fingerprint of writing style, some odd inconsistencies emerged. While several documents were clearly penned by Pierre Plandard and Philippe de Cherisy in the mid-20th century, at least one section displayed a writing pattern that matched no known modern author. Its syntax, rhythm, and archaic phrasing aligned more closely with late Renaissance Latinism. A fragment, possibly predating its alleged forgers. That fragment mentions the anointed blood in exile. The term hadn't appeared in any mainstream literature before 1956, but it's now being echoed in newer documents and in encrypted messages found on esoteric forums. Then there's the explosion of online communities trying to crowdsource the hunt. Reddit boards filled with translated Templar logs, Discord servers that analyze the frescoes of Rosslyn Chapel pixel by pixel, even TikTok accounts that track the position of ancient stars over European cathedrals. To find ley lines, and in between the nonsense and the noise, something moves. A rhythm, a story. You might laugh, but history has always hidden its truths in plain sight, hoping the red eyes would someday see. And the Vatican, too, has entered the digital age. Their apostolic archive, once the most secretive in the world, has begun to release select scans to the public, but for every scroll available to read, hundreds more remain sealed. AI programs have already flagged anomalous indexing patterns, rooms mislabeled, collections temporarily inaccessible, and keywords scrubbed from databases without explanation. A few particularly controversial collections, those from the early Carolingian period, are marked under review indefinitely. It's almost as if someone else is watching the watchers. The question arises, if you could train a machine to find the Merovingian line, would you? Or more provocatively, has someone already done it? It would only take one powerful foundation, one group with the motive, the funding, and the algorithm, not to reveal the truth, but to hold it quietly, strategically. Because in the age of digital transparency, secrecy requires a new form of silence, invisibility in plain sight, code written not in ink, but in absence. There's a growing theory that the true custodians of the bloodline, if they still exist, are no longer burying scrolls in tombs or carving messages into stone. They're embedding them in metadata, hash signatures, zero-width spaces, steganographic noise in digital images. A photo of a rose may contain an encrypted name. A cathedral's virtual tour may contain time-stamped echoes of a grail-shaped geotag. You wouldn't know unless you knew how to look, which brings us full circle, back to the very idea of the grail not as cup, not as scroll, but as a signal, transmitted across time, encrypted into flesh and language, and now, perhaps, into silicon. You can call it conspiracy or folklore or metadata madness, but here we are, chapters deep, and the picture no longer resembles a theory. It's become a network, a lattice of overlapping truths buried by power and unearthed by code. The bloodline may not need temples or knights anymore. It may only need a password and someone willing to type it in. Take a breath. Let all the fragments float in your mind. The long-haired kings, the bees, the whispered names in stone, the maps drawn in starlight, the chapel carvings, the hidden archives, the monks, the masons. It's time now to step back and look again, not as a skeptic, not as a believer, but simply as someone following a thread, because after centuries of speculation, silence, and subterfuge, the story of the Merovingian bloodline hasn't dissolved into myth. It has survived quietly, impossibly, deliberately. So, what do we actually know? The Merovingians ruled parts of Europe from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Their reign was marked by oddities, divine right conferred not by coronation, but by their very blood. Their hair, never cut, was said to hold spiritual power. They were Christian, but uncomfortably close to earlier pagan rituals. And then, suddenly, they were overthrown, not with a war, but with a whisper. The Carolingians replaced them with papal blessing, and history was rewritten almost overnight. Why? Well, because maybe that bloodline carried something the church couldn't control, not heresy in the traditional sense, but heritage, a living legacy that said holiness didn't reside solely in priests, bishops, or Rome, but in people, in blood, in womb, in woman. Think back to Mary Magdalene, recast by early church fathers as a reformed sinner, scrubbed of her potential role as spiritual partner and progenitor. And think again of Dagobert II, murdered in the forest after years in exile, perhaps because he threatened to reclaim not just a throne, but a truth. Layered atop this are the Priory of Sion, the Templars, the Vatican's missing records, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Sinclairs, the digital breadcrumbs. Over and over, different players arise, but the theme remains the same: protect the secret or suppress it. We can't say with certainty that the Merovingians descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. No one alive today can. But here's what we can say: someone believed it enough to hide it, enough to kill for it, enough to preserve it in art, symbol, architecture, and blood for over 1,000 years. And if the story was truly nonsense, why has it never gone away? If the lineage was a lie, why spend centuries crafting layers of protection, diversion, and disinformation? Why embed clues in cathedrals, bury maps beneath tombs, smuggle names into genealogies, and commission paintings that show Magdalene not as a disciple, but as a mother? Perhaps the truth has always lived in shadows because it threatens the very structures that define our civilization. A divine bloodline born not from heavenly magic, but from human union. One that says the sacred and the human were never meant to be separate, that kings can bleed and God can love. And in that idea, if you really listen, you might hear the echo of something revolutionary. A church built on Peter, but haunted by Mary. A world ruled by emperors, but shaped by secrets. And all of it pointing to a name nearly lost in time: Dagobert, the forgotten king, the exiled blood, the thread that, once pulled, unravels the fabric of divine right and replaces it with something deeper, not supremacy, but inheritance. So where does the bloodline live now? In a Scottish vault, in Vatican walls, in a dusty library in Spain, or walking anonymously down a crowded street, unknown even to itself? Maybe it's not about finding the final heir. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's about remembering that such a legacy was possible, and that power, when hidden, always leaves a trail. A fleur-de-lis is carved too deeply, a name passed down quietly, a ritual that doesn't quite belong, a child born to carry something more than memory, a bloodline in the shadows. So here you are, drifting at the edge of the mystery, where the voices have quieted and the echoes grow faint. You followed the thread from tombs to temples, cathedrals to castles, symbols to silicon. And now the question that lingers like incense in a forgotten chapel: was it all a lie, or the most carefully hidden truth in history? Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a library, vast and silent. Somewhere in its deepest corridor lies a single scroll. No title, no author, just a name and a bloodline. Perhaps it tells of kings who ruled by right of birth, not from nobility, but from divinity. Or perhaps it's just a story, embellished, romanticized, woven into legend to soothe the aching need for connection to something greater. History isn't merely facts, it's memory. And memory lies easily, but forgets reluctantly. There is no document that proves beyond doubt that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a child. There's no DNA record that places a Merovingian king within the genealogy of Christ. And yet, what if that's the point? Maybe truth was never meant to be proved, only preserved. And maybe, just maybe, you're part of it. Not in blood, but in curiosity, in the simple act of remembering, reaching, reconstructing. The church has its reasons. The Templars had their vows. The Freemasons had their riddles. But you, here now, you have your wonder. And wonder is the most dangerous thing of all because it refuses to be satisfied. Whether this story is real or not, whether the bloodline still flows or has long since dried, doesn't really matter now, does it? What matters is that the symbols endure, the whispers continue, the light in the stained glass still flickers across Magdalene's face, and the truth, or the possibility of it, is still out there, waiting to be found. So, the next time you walk past a cathedral, or stare into a painting, or feel that strange sense that something ancient is watching, maybe you'll remember. Maybe you'll look a little closer. Maybe you'll hear the code pulsing just beneath the silence. And in that silence, the line remains, waiting.